Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Connor Freeman, who is here from the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, and the co-host of Conflicts of Interest with Carl Anzalone and Will Porter. I had many people on from that crowd before. Scott Horton, Carl Anzalone, all do really good work over there. But also Connor does. I've been trying to get him on for a while, as he's kind of not necessarily a silent partner, but you go a bit more under the radar. But you still do really good work, and you did a really good piece with Scott Horton, which we'll be kind of covering today. So the topic kind of today will be Israel, Hamas, and their relationship of more specific kind of Netanyahu's government, but it goes back a little bit further with propping up Hamas for their own political benefit of basically splitting the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to prevent a Palestinian state. On the face of it, people who maybe don't know that think that sounds really, really, really controversial, but it's actually really widely reported in the US media and Israeli media, going back, 2010 kind of to now. Even since October 7th, it's discussed, high-level US officials and Israeli officials giving comments, and then also just actual Israeli officials and even Netanyahu saying it from the horse's mouth. And even people like I watched I can't remember the opposition, but Dave DeCamp did a debate, and even on the other side, on the pro-Israel side, none of them disagree that this is a fact that Israel did prop up Hamas. They just say normally it was a mistake, or it was an error, or they did it for these reasons. It wasn't this nefarious. Wherever you fall, it is pretty openly admitted that this is kind of an unofficial policy, and there's lots of all kind of articles we can get into over the years. So I know I just gave like a brief overview, but I just think a lot of people maybe just think on the face of it it's nonsense, but it's weirdly kind of an open secret. But thanks for being here today, Connor. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Louis. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, really good to have you here. Hopefully we won't have too many more issues today. But yeah, so do you just want to, I guess, tell people where you wrote an article with Scott Horton a few months back about this? So first of all, what kind of led you to this, or information did you know before? Is this something you've kind of newly discovered since October 7th, it's kind of blown up, or was there something you kind of knew like this was the kind of stuff, because it kind of changes everything about the war that it's blown up in their faces?
Sure. Well, I'd known that there had been a long term policy from Israel of supporting Hamas, and it's often more or less oversimplified where people will say that Israel created Hamas, which is not actually true. They certainly supported it and cultivated it. They didn't create it. And in fact, that's an interesting aspect of the story, but we'll get to in a moment. The reason we wrote the article was Scott's knew immediately that was basically the gaping wound in the narrative that was used to support the war. So we immediately got set to work on it. I think after the first week of the war, or before even the end of the first week, I remember Scott calling me up and talking to me about this article he wanted to put together. And so Scott had done virtually all the research. Like I said, I was familiar with the topic, but not nearly as well versed as he was. So I got his notes, and I got a ton of articles that I read and other resources, and then went through and wrote it up. And then he and I worked on it together and expanded it and pared it down in places. But we wanted to basically present the most comprehensive case for why this is, well, ultimately blowback, not just for the brutal occupation and tyranny and apartheid regime that's been ruling the Palestinians. The Israelis have imposed on the Palestinians, I should say, since 1967, longer than the Soviet Union ruled Eastern Europe, but also because of this policy of covertly backing Hamas as a way to undercut the secular nationalist PLO, who has much greater international standing. And we'll get into more of the details of that, but so that's what we did, and thankfully we were able to get the article out before the end of October at antiwar.com, and then we reprinted at the Institute, and it's been referenced a ton of times by Dave Smith even on the Joe Rogan show and other platforms like that, and in his debates. So we've been very happy about that, and it's one of, I think just a great piece of work from our part of the libertarian movement that I'm really proud of. So yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is, and we cite a ton of different reports on this, and like you said, it's been covered. I said covert from the U.S. perspective. It's the policy of bolstering Hamas in order to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state and to freeze the political process is well known in Israel. In fact, a day after the October 7th attack, there was a huge piece published in Haaretz or maybe it was Times of Israel. Actually, we quote it and cite it in the article, but it had a title almost exactly like our article, where they just blame Netanyahu. This is what your policy is reaped. And so the interesting thing is, this goes back, and Richard Sale has a great piece about this in United Press International, and we link to it. So basically, after Israel seized the Gaza Strip from Egypt in the 1967 war, and they had already cleansed so many Palestinian refugees and now their descendants to the area during 47 and 48, the Nakba, and then the 1948 war. And so Israel starts this preemptive war in 1967 and seizes the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, etc. And in Gaza, basically Nasser had been repressing the Islamists, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And Israel, fearing the PLO and the more nationalist, socialist kind of elements of the resistance in Palestine, wanted to actually kind of loosen those restrictions. And by the 1970s, they were cultivating the precursor to Hamas, which was called the Islamic Center. And this, as Richard Sale explains, and he's interviewing CIA officials and former U.S. intelligence officials who explain that the money was coming from the oil-producing states and directly and indirectly from Israel. And the policy was specifically a right-wing Israeli plot to undercut the PLO and to support this alternative Islamist faction. So by the early 1980s, as a result of Israel's war with Hezbollah, well, not Hezbollah, when they invaded southern Lebanon and occupied it, and this went on for almost 20 more years, the Hezbollah formed in opposition to the Israeli invasion around 1982-83. And at the same time, Hamas begins to radicalize as a result of that war, the rise of Hezbollah and the overthrow of the Shah Reza Pahlavi in Iran and the subsequent establishment of the Islamic Republic. And so by the 1980s, there's, the first Intifada comes, and Hamas is formed in 1987. Now, by this time, the PLO is starting to soften its maximalist demands and is saying it will recognize Israel within 67 borders. Hamas has since said virtually the same thing. Not that they would recognize Israel, but that they would settle for a Palestinian state in 67 borders, really 22% of historical Palestine. And so after the PLO did that, and at the same time, Hamas is becoming more radicalized in the first Intifada. And by the early 90s, in 1994, they start carrying out suicide bombings, and they're being cracked down upon by the IDF and Fatah. The money kept flowing. In fact, as Hamas got more violent, the aid stepped up. And that's in the Wall Street. That's in all these mainstream sources from intelligence officials and Israeli officials. So by the early 2000s, you have, after the Oslo Accords peace process begins and the PA is established, which is more or less of, as Scott puts it in the article, they run a minimum security prison for the Israelis. They're a subcontractor trained and backed by the U.S. and Britain and the Israelis. And of course, the Israelis occupy the West, and just like Gaza have since 67. And after the peace process more or less falls apart in 2000 and the second Intifada comes, which was provoked by the Israelis. Ariel Sharon went and desecrated the Al-Aqsa Mosque and tried to provoke an attack. And this is what happened. And 4,500 Palestinians were killed and about 1,000 Israelis. And so there's a policy initiated by the Likud in 2005 called the disengagement. And this is often cited by Zionists and pro-Israel, people in the media and wherever. They'll say, well, we gave them Gaza. We left Gaza. We traded land for peace. That's not true. I mean, the consensus of the international community is that Gaza remains under military occupation. I mean, they control the water, the food, all the border crossings. And this is particularly after the blockade was imposed in 2007. But they never ended the occupation. What they did was they pulled the settlers out and they pulled the IDF out of Gaza. So then the U.S. In 2006 has been encouraging elections as part of their neocon democracy promotion program. So they encourage elections in Palestine. And Hamas wins a plurality in the elections. And they're trying to form a power. They were trying to make a power sharing agreement and form a coalition government with Fatah, basically. And before that can happen, the neocons, namely Elliot Abrams and Condoleezza Rice, basically seize the opportunity to try and foment a coup led by Fatah against Hamas. And so more arms are flowed into Fatah at the U.S.'s behest, and there's a civil war that breaks out. Well, Hamas actually wins. So the coup backfires, and Hamas seizes control of the Gaza Strip. And there haven't been any elections held since 2006. And this is again used to say, well, this is why the Palestinians in Gaza, they voted for this government. They support October 7th. They support Hamas. They voted them in power. More than half this, even if that was a good argument, which it's not, of course, it sounds like something Osama bin Laden would say, which is, is typically what how the U.S. will justify sanctions regimes and other attacks on civilian populations. But nevertheless, this is in 2006. More than half the population of Gaza, or approximately half anyway, are children. So none of these people voted for Hamas. If anything, they were toddlers who probably weren't even born then. And it's not their fault that elections haven't been held in this basically the Warsaw Ghetto that's under a full blockade from the air, land, and sea. They have no army, no navy, no air force, no air defenses. And they've been bombed repeatedly in large scale and smaller scale attacks by the Israelis this whole time, and put under basically a diet regulation program where they allow in just enough food to keep the Palestinians from starving. And this has been going on since 2007. Well, so after Hamas defeated Fatah in this civil war, the Israelis imposed that blockade, and this was used to justify it. And so, but the truth is that disengagement policy was from the beginning a plan to thwart any sort of further discussions about forming a Palestinian state, any kind of two-state solution. And Dov Weissglass has the main quote about this that we cite early on in the article. He was an advisor to Prime Minister Ariel Sharon at the time, and he says, the disengagement plan is we're doing this to put the peace process in formaldehyde. It cancels all talks, any discussions about Jerusalem, borders, the occupation, a Palestinian state, right of return. All of this is canceled out. And basically Hamas is our certificate we can take to the international community and say, we have no partner for peace. And we basically have a hostile state, living on our border. In fact, let me get the actual quote because I don't want to miss anything.
Yeah,
so
I know. Yeah, I think while you're getting up, you paraphrase that definitely really well. They also basically mentioned that we have, the sign off from both sides of the houses of representatives and Congress in America. So basically, got the blessing of the United States that well done for doing this, thumb up, and then really it was actually an alternative motive while looking good was to freeze the peace plan until they look like a state like Finland. Feel free
exactly.
to quote.
And so since then, it's been in 2009, Israel launches it's not Protective Edge, it was let me see. I'm blanking on the name of the operation from 2009. But anyway, Israel launches a major bombing campaign at the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009, and they begin to carry out more and more of these attacks into, I believe, it was Operation Cast Lead. And then in 2014, they wage Operation Protective Edge. There's another bombing campaign in 2012. Operation Guardian of the Walls is from 2021, and so throughout these attacks on this open air concentration camp, which is how actually Israeli military officials have referred to Gaza. That's not just a term that you might hear a leftist say. It's a commonly acknowledged reality. And
can't remember his name. I'll get it up, put it up on the screen, the show notes. But someone uses the term concentration camp. I think he was a national security advisor, and he wrote it in a private memo because it came out in WikiLeaks. So this is something that they said in private as well, that Gaza is basically a concentration camp. If you don't want to go that far, you've got David Cameron, then Prime Minister, 2010, 11 or 12, not sure when it was. I think 2010, where he calls Gaza open air prison. So take your pick.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this time, the economy in Gaza falls apart. The economy such as it is. You have about 50% unemployment, and they're blocking the supplies of electricity, potable water, building materials after these bombing campaigns, medicine and medical equipment, the whole gamut. And during this time, the argument, Hamas is this hostile state, as there's another WikiLeaks dump where one of the files that has one of the cables that has an Israeli official making that same comment, that now we can treat Gaza as a hostile state because we can point to Hamas. So during this time, supposedly Hamas is the Israelis just want peace, and Hamas is what's standing in the way. So beginning in the later 2000s, then especially as these bombing campaigns going on, between 2012 and 2018, more than $1 billion is transferred to Hamas with Israel's green light. And it comes primarily from Qatar. In fact, there's a story that I covered at the Institute recently that was, I believe, broke in Ynet, which is an Israeli outlet. But during this time, Qatar is, especially as the years go on after the 2014 war, they're becoming less and less, more and more, I should say, reluctant to provide this money to Hamas. And the Israelis have repeatedly sent, as Avigdor Lieberman, the former defense minister, has quoted, Netanyahu would send the director of the Mossad, I believe it was Yossi Cohen, to go to Doha begging for money to go to Hamas. And in 2018, Doha was getting, reluctant, more and more hesitant, and they were saying, we're worried about running afoul of sanctions from international institutions. This is funding terrorism, is it not? And Netanyahu tells the Trump Treasury Department, run by Steve Mnuchin at the time, to write a letter, basically, and they did. They wrote a letter and they told the Qataris, don't worry, we want you to do this. We won't hit you with sanctions. We're telling you to do this. And so this went on for many, many years. And at the same time, there was never an effort made to reconcile this apartheid state that the Palestinians have been living under since 1967. You've had, as I say, thousands of civilians killed in these bombing campaigns, tens of thousands more injured. So much of the infrastructure had been destroyed. At the same time, there have been expanding settlements in the West Bank this whole time. And so now I believe you have 500,000 to 700,000 illegal settlers living in the West Bank. And they just announced, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister of the Religious Zionism Party, they just announced the largest settlement expansion in more than 30 years. And they announced more since the International Court of Justice, the World Court, ruled that the occupation and the settlement enterprise is illegal, which everybody already knew. But again, it's increasing the diplomatic isolation of Israel and concurrently the United States. And so this policy of backing Hamas was actually pretty open. So in our article, we have dozens and dozens of quotes from top Likud officials, government ministers, former prime ministers, including Netanyahu himself, multiple quotes from him saying that this was the policy. And we specifically did it to prevent negotiations over the West Bank or Gaza. And the big fear was that if there was ever to be a situation where Hamas falls and the PA takes over Gaza, then you would hear even voices from leftist critics and liberal critics in Israel. They'd be demanding negotiations, say there's no reason we can't negotiate a two-state solution now, and Israelis can live in peace and so forth. But of course, the Likud and the other pro-settler factions in Israeli society have always had their eye on all of historic Palestine, and particularly the West Bank. In fact, a big part of Jared Kushner's deal of the century was annexing the Jordan Valley, which they're moving closer and closer toward now since October 7th. That's part of this most recent expansion I just referred to. But so I mean, this policy carried over. There was obviously a security breach there. We put in the article all the different, at least at the time, there's been more since, but ignored warnings from Israeli soldiers that they saw Hamas was planning the attack. Documents that had been obtained more than a year in advance, I believe, that had basically the whole game plan for the attack laid out. So there's this horrible security breach because the Israelis, so Netanyahu came back to power at the end of 2022, and he ramped up settlement expansion to record levels. Was bombing Syria every week. In fact, Yoav Gallant was boasting by May that we've doubled the airstrikes in Syria. And actually, I'm not even sure that's true because Israel has basically been bombing Syria every week since about 2011 or so, when the civil war started in the U.S. Actually, it's a civil war. It was more of a CIA dirty war where we backed al-Qaeda. And Israel played a huge role in that as well, supporting al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Just to jump in quickly, just to play devil's advocate on this, I know you've just said the Netanyahu and the other officials obviously have quotes, but some people will go, well, the reason Israel was going to Qatar was so that they could provide money for humanitarian reasons. So you're saying this is all to do with propping up Hamas to split against the West Bank and the PA. So The money that was being sent, nothing to do with humanitarian aid, you're saying it was to keep Hamas's engine going, basically.
Well, yes, from the Israeli perspective, yes. I mean, from what the Qataris intended, that's more ambiguous. The money was being spent on healthcare and education and other aid. But nevertheless, it's still, you have Israel telling Qatar to send more than $1 billion to Hamas without ever making any efforts to negotiate a settlement to give the Palestinians their freedom, to lift the full blockade. And they continued bombing civilians. And the economy, as I said, was already, in completely dire straits. I mean, like I said, more than 50% unemployment. So the idea that they were trying to help the Palestinians live a better life or prevent further attacks by Hamas is just ludicrous. And it's belied by all the quotes that we actually have from even people that are not from Likud saying that this is the policy. So, I mean, I understand why Israelis would want to frame it the way, the New York Times put out that piece in the title, they say buying quiet. But the truth is there's no real, if you look at the history of the policy going back to the 70s and the 80s, the raison d'etre was to prevent to undercut the secular nationalists who would actually have more of an international standing to negotiate peace. And then it morphed into, as Hamas got more violent and took over Gaza, as just basically the perfect excuse for maintaining the status quo. And eventually there's other quotes from Israeli officials where it's basically stated that they knew that they were going to have to basically periodically cleanse mow the lawn, as they say. which means basically bombing the Palestinians is the resistance is sort of building up. You just bomb and bomb and bomb to demoralize people and break down their military capabilities periodically. But they're bombing so many civilians and children and women. It's it's to even accept that at its face is kind of ridiculous. But so I mean, the idea that they were trying to negotiate any kind of if they were trying to, help the Palestinians more or less prevent an economic crisis, that's just completely belied by the facts and their own arguments. I mean, Netanyahu himself told members of his own party, and this is in Haaretz, he said that, anyone who wants to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state must support our policy of bolstering Hamas, and that includes the Qatari money coming into the Strip. And so it's right there. I mean, it from out of the prime minister's mouth, and the longest serving prime minister of Israel, the face of this genocidal war, that the purpose here was, and look, excuse me, it's not as if there's been any sort of discussion of negotiating a two-state solution since October 7th. Because they've been expanding in the West Bank. The settler attacks and the IDF massacres of Palestinians have gone up. And there's been, I believe, more than 30 airstrikes, the UN has said, in the West Bank since October 7th, which is kind of unheard of. They hadn't carried out an airstrike. I think it was the attack on the Jenin refugee camp in 2023. That was the first time there had been an airstrike in the West Bank for like 15 years. But my point is, the party, since Netanyahu took power at the end of 22, you had record numbers of settlement expansions. They were bombing Syria. They were bombing Lebanon in May. They had bombed Gaza in a smaller bombing campaign in May. Record numbers of Palestinians have been killed as well, primarily in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. One of the reasons, the justifications put forward by Hamas for the October 7th attack was the brutal attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan last year. Now, they always attack the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan. But as in the past, you saw videos all over the web of men, women, children, the elderly being absolutely just beaten to a pulp by Israeli police. The usual sound bombs and flashbangs and rubber bullets and people destroying parts of the mosque complex, of the Al-Aqsa complex. And so they were always, they were hell bent on seizing the West Bank, and you can see that now, especially because it's so openly put forward by Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and the Jewish Power Party and the Religious Zionism Party and other officials in the military. And just, you could look at what's happened in the West Bank since the 7th. The settlers have been running wild there virtually since the war began. And so
just before you get further into the West Bank, because I would like to move towards the settlers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, but just going back to some of the stuff you said, again, Israel using Islamists, the more radical group, sounds, crazy. Why would they want the most radical people who maybe the most likely to hate Israel or themselves is, if you look at strategies of the US and Britain throughout the Cold War and since, it was the same strategy. It's not like Britain used the Muslim Brotherhood, the UK and US backed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and you had the then head of the ISI in Pakistan, their intelligence agency, then Prime Minister going, we pumped the most radical Muslims we could, full of zeal and out that they wanted the most radical Muslims. So this has been a strategy to normally, because the nationalists are more first of all able to take kind of serious on the international stage. They normally nationalize resources. Like, they hated NASA, they hated the rise of nationalism in Egypt and other countries, the British. So they fund the most brutal ones. And then if you look at our biggest allies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all the Gulf nations, they're all a strict sect of Wahhabism Muslims compared to more moderate kind of nationalists, as they normally kind of sell out their own people for the interest. So I know it's a bit different in Israel, because Israel's interests are a lot more narrow than Britain, who basically they're going out for an adventure in the Middle East and playing the game, where Israel's not necessarily playing the global game. It's just it does if it benefits itself, but it's more about its own existence. But funding and arming the craziest groups has always normally been a strategy to split people off. So and just going back to some of the quotes you said, there was the Ministry of Information at the time. She's a lady, I can't remember her name, but I mean since October 7th, she put out a tweet saying you basically need to erase the whole of Gaza. They're all monsters. It's over. But even she said, I think maybe before October 7th, I'm sure she put it out on Facebook. I'll put it up on the screen. I'll put these quotes in the show notes, where she says, what Netanyahu is propping up Hamas to split Gaza and the West Bank, and the reason he's doing it is to make sure we don't end up like Gaza and all this stuff.
Right.
So their own officials are coming out and saying it, and there's not really any real pushback online, where normally a story comes out, a conspiracy theory, and straight away fact check, or New York Times coming out saying no, that's not true. There's no article saying this bizarre theory going around that Israel props up Hamas, this crazy conspiracy theory. You don't see any of that, because it's just widely and if you follow Israeli media compared to American, I mean, they go a lot further than what we do, because obviously we're quite scared. If you actually read Israeli media, either they do scathing reports, or they openly say, in favor of it. They're like, of course we're doing this because of this. You get Israelis. The one who did the concentration camp comment, he wrote an article saying, we just need to wipe out Gaza, destroy everything, just destroy everything, all the infrastructure.
Yeah, bomb and bomb and bomb and bomb.
Yeah, and since just your point about Netanyahu, I mean, I think even people like Piers Morgan, find it quite easy to even look at Netanyahu and go, I'm pro-Israel, whatever it be, but Netanyahu, he's not the right guy for Israel. Just look at his face, he just looks like a dark character. But he even went on TV after October 7th, says, I've done the most out of any president to prevent a Palestinian state, and I'm proud of it. What does he mean by that? One, obviously you could say bundling negotiations or whatever, but maybe he's also referring to, I don't know, we've had strategies to prevent it, and that's part of it. But whether you want to say it's because of that, he actually just said, I'm proud of that. Since October 7th, lots of officials have come out and said, no, I don't think we can have a Palestinian state. They've just passed some law resolution in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, about no Israeli state. So the mask is coming off. Some people will say it's because, we can't have
no
a
Palestinian state. That, as they say, will maintain full security control the entire area west of the Jordan River. So they're very open about it. In fact, when the Knesset did pass that vote rejecting, saying we're totally against a Palestinian state, they asked a State Department spokesman, some reporters asked him in one of the briefings about it. And our own State Department, who nominally supports a two-state solution, that's still the official position of Washington. Of course, it's meaningless, but they say they actually told the reporters, we will refer you to Israeli officials. We're not going to speak to the the policies of the Israeli legislature. We don't feel that that's for us to speak on. So it's just so transparent. And to your point about the basically the Gulf dictatorships, the Sunni dictatorships that the U.S. backs in the region, this is again another part of the Netanyahu doctrine, which was strongly backed by Donald Trump and Joe Biden's administration and Tony Blinken. And the idea is, and it was actually first, at least the earliest outline I've seen of it, I believe, was the Clean Break document, which was written by David Wormser and Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith and presented to Benjamin Netanyahu when he first became prime minister in 1996. And basically the idea was to, basically normalize relation, and it's grown into this Abraham Accords. And basically the policy is they normalize once you've solidified this idea, we have no partner for peace, and you have this money going to Hamas, and you can kind of maintain the status quo. Beginning in 2020, the Israelis, under these U.S. staged deals, brokered these so-called peace agreements between Israel and these other Gulf dictatorships that were never at war with Israel, like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and then later Sudan and Morocco. But the idea is, we see Israel, the Jewish state, normalizing with these Arab states, these Muslim states, and we're bringing peace to the region. What they were actually doing was building the foundations for a NATO-style coalition that was going to encircle Iran for a future war. They were also sweetening the deals with the Bahrain and the UAE, for instance, with major arms sales from the U.S. of advanced weapons, including F-35s to the UAE, which they didn't get, but that's another story. And drones and more bombs, and same for Bahrain, more arms deals for Bahrain. And the idea was, like I said, to normalize the apartheid status quo for the Palestinians, and basically demonstrating, which Pompeo had boasted about, that it sets the precedent that Israel can normalize with these countries in the region absent either a Palestinian state or Palestinians having equal rights under a single state. So what Netanyahu actually went to the UN 2 weeks before the General Assembly, about 2 weeks before the October 7th attack, and held up a map that said the new Middle East, and all of historic Palestine was just said Israel. So the message was, we've won, we beat the Palestinians, you're going to remain subjugated forever, and we are now integrating ourselves more fully into the region. And at the time, Tom Friedman in the New York Times, the Biden administration has been working even since the 7th, which is even more ludicrous, on a normalization deal between Riyadh and Tel Aviv, where we're going to help Saudi Arabia build a nuclear energy program and provide them a security pact style, a security pact similar to the ones that we have with Japan and South Korea, and more advanced weapons and other sweeteners to the deal. And the problem is Tom Friedman was so excited, and the other Zionists saying that it's going to open the door to Israel ingratiating itself with the whole Muslim world. This deal is the key. And we can also hinder China's, prominence in the region as well. And it can be, Biden's biggest foreign policy win. And so the Saudis have always said that, we won't normalize with Israel unless there's a two-state solution. And so what they were saying was now, and before the war, they're saying we're getting closer and closer. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman even said that directly. Even an interview with Brett Baer on Fox News. And the premise was that we will do it if the Israelis move toward a two-state solution. And so it's they've loosened the qualifications that they had under the Arab peace plan, and it's not as solid. It's basically the Israelis they probably could just say that, but Netanyahu, as you said, and that the government that's in power is just committed absolutely, especially for the domestic purposes. Netanyahu needs to stay in power, and his legacy will be, especially after allowing the attack to happen and the policy of bolstering Hamas. He has to basically save himself from landing in prison for the rest of his life. He was already on trial for corruption when he was in power before the attack. And so, it's very clear they have a plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza. Gila Gamaliel, formerly the Minister of Intelligence, I forget what position she holds now. I think she's the Minister of Science and Technology or something like that now. But she has said, very early on, there was a document leaked from the ministry that outlined a plan to expel all the Palestinians basically into the Sinai Peninsula, and into the Sinai Desert. And so she's basically then later on bragged about how my plan has so much support within the Knesset. And we've heard this, same plan uttered by so many different ministers and officials in this government, including Ben Gvir. One of the things that the most radical ones will say, it's even more shameful. They'll go, it's voluntary immigration, but no victory without settlement. We're going to take back Gaza. Otherwise, all of our soldiers have died in vain. We're taking all of Gaza back. And they've already seized about 26% of the strip thus far in the war by seizing the Netrazim corridor in central Gaza, the Philadelphia corridor, which is basically the Gaza-Egypt border. And then they have a stretch of land that they've taken, destroyed all these buildings and agricultural resources in the area, but it stretches about a kilometer in width along the whole length of the strip. So they've taken already 26%. And of course, it does appear at the same time that they're also using this opportunity to go to war with Hezbollah, to finally wipe them out as a threat. And really the purpose of that is also because they want to cleanse the West Bank. And we've already seen over in southern Lebanon and in the West Bank, well over 500 people have been killed, including hundreds of children by the Israeli forces as the war has been ongoing in Gaza. And so they're very committed to taking all this land. And so, yeah, I mean, that's essentially the state of things. And Netanyahu's government, they can, as you said, they can basically say whatever they want. A lot of American officials will try and, or as you say, Piers Morgan, people in the media will try and paint it as like, well, Netanyahu's the problem. It's not Israel. But the vast, vast majority of the country supports this war. Over 80%, I believe, in the latest poll, or they say that it needs to be escalated, actually. And Gideon Levy from Haaretz, who's a terrific writer, and he's an Israeli, but he's against the occupation. He wrote an article months ago called the Unanimous War. And he says this war has more support than any war Israel's ever fought. There's virtually no opposition. And so, I mean, pretty much the society is hell bent. We've seen so many war crimes committed, people being tortured and, basically women and children being just picked off for fun. A lot of Israeli soldiers, we've heard soldiers tell 972 MAG, the Tel Aviv based outlet, that we shoot Palestinians out of boredom. There were a couple of American surgeons who just returned from Gaza who went there in April. And they discuss how, and then a team of I believe 4 dozen different nurses and doctors who've been to Gaza since the war started just sent a letter demanding that the U.S. stop arming Israel. They said that we all treated children who had been shot in the chest and in the head. And these surgeons tell these stories and they go, no child is shot twice by the world's best snipers by accident. And they're just, he's just talking about how I've never seen more incinerated children, more shredded children, mutilated children from the bombing and from being trapped under rubble. And it's just, it's unbelievable. We've sent Israel at least on paper that are confirmed, 28,000 bombs and missiles to fuel this genocide, including 14,000, 2,000 pound bombs. And by the end of December, all the experts like Robert Pape and these various analyses that were being published in the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, were already comparing the bombing campaign to Dresden and Hamburg in World War II. It's just absolutely unfathomable, really. They've destroyed. The UN said, I believe last month that maybe a little earlier than that Israel had already destroyed, not even damaged, destroyed more than half the buildings in all of Gaza. It's just been unbelievable. Hospitals, schools, mosques, churches, refugee camps, all these agricultural lands that they've laid waste to just further to tighten the starvation blockade. And so, it's terrifying. I mean, the ICJ has said that it's plausibly a genocide, and we see more and more UN officials all the time saying the same thing. At least, and I think these numbers are very conservative, and unfortunately, well, it's unfortunate that it's happening in the first place. But because of the way the war is being conducted, I'm sure you saw that more than 86% of the strip, the UN is now saying is under evacuation order. As a no-go zone. This is where the Israelis can kill anybody they want and bomb wherever they want. And so in many of these areas, they've been already bombing for months and months. These were the areas that were labeled as the safe zones, like the Al-Mawasi tent camp that people who were driven from Rafah were told to go to. And then the Israelis will, for instance, drop 5 2,000-pound bombs on tents full of women and children and slaughter, in that case, This was on July 13th. They killed more than 90 people. So it's just, this has been absolutely catastrophic. And yeah, I mean, my government is the Netanyahu speech, last week demonstrates once again that I'm happy that 136 Democrats boycotted the speech, and Thomas Massey did as well, at least one Republican. But you can see that the American Congress and the status quo, from Trump to Bobby Kennedy to Jr. to Joe Biden, they're fully committed to supporting this war. Despite any of their misgivings about Netanyahu that you might hear periodically from Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi or someone in the squad. It's just been relentless, and it doesn't seem like there's anything that's going to change it. I mean, Netanyahu has been blocking peace deals with Hamas this entire time. We can get into more about the indirect negotiations that the Qataris and the Egyptians have been brokering, but again, to illustrate, some of the family members of the hostages who were seized by Hamas on the 7th were demonstrating during his speech. They were just wearing shirts that said "Seal the deal now," and they were arrested. So that's the mentality of our government, who is the chief backer of this whole genocide. Yitzhak Brick, the major from the IDF, former major from the IDF, has said, this, without the U.S., this war can't even last. We own, every plane, every bullet, every bomb. And once we cut off the tap, Israel is pretty much helpless to carry out an operation of this scale. So, it's an American war on the Palestinians, which should be something that would never happen. I mean, the idea of America being at war with the Palestinians, one of the poorest, most defenseless populations in the world. This is the world's greatest empire. And yeah, I mean, it's just devastating. It's up to 39,363 Palestinians have been killed, mostly women and children at this point. Tens of thousands more injured, including 38,000 wounded children and at least 10,000. But that number, I think, has been stuck there since November or so. At least 10,000 or more people buried under rubble and presumed dead.
Yeah, just going back to what you said earlier about the UN speech Netanyahu gave. Hearing Scott Horton mention that, I was like, right, I've got to go watch it. And yeah, he holds up the map, as you said, no Gaza Strip, no West Bank, just Israel. And if you watch it, because he's done a whole speech, it's like 30-something minutes, but 13 minutes is just about that. The rest is about like AI and whatever else, technology. And it's really interesting to listen to, because he's basically going, throughout history in the Cold War, the Palestinians, basically had hold over it, where the Arab nations wouldn't make peace, even though, like you said, the Gulf nations weren't really at war with them. It was obviously Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq. Egypt and Jordan made peace long ago, so they're gone. So basically leave Syria and Iraq, who are enemies. Basically going, Palestine had a hold over these negotiations. The Arab states wouldn't make a deal unless Palestine got a state. And then he goes, well, that's over, basically. That era is over. Now we, through, the new Middle East, he calls it, we made peace. Mentions the Abraham Accords. Peace is the wrong word. It's normalizing official relations, right? So, like you said, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. And you said, obviously, the UAE was F-35s, but they didn't get them due to their relations with China. And then Bahrain, they got F-16s. I'm not sure about Sudan. Don't know if it was debt, maybe. But Morocco.
They were also taken off of the state sponsors of terror list by the U.S.
Morocco's the maybe the craziest, where in exchange for peace with a state who illegally occupies territory, they said to Morocco, don't worry, you can have your own slice of occupied territory in the Western Sahara. So I'd never even heard of the Western Sahara myself existing. You never hear about it. But on a map, got Morocco here, Western Sahara Desert. That was a country as part of the African Union, Morocco's annexed a big section of that, and that was a present from the Trump administration for normalizing with Israel. And you think, oh no, this sounds a little crazy. They didn't normalize because of that, and then it's just open. You're like, this and. But it's even Pompeo said to the Times of Israel, it's this article where it lays it out where he's like, also the assassination of Soleimani was a big part in this. It showed the US was willing to step up to Iran. You're like, what? Like they assassinated this guy, almost started World War III before COVID happened. And They're like, yeah, that was a good part of the deal. But so that UN speech, really interesting to listen to. Basically, Netanyahu bragging. And he is bragging if you listen to his tone. It's basically like, yeah, the Palestinians thought they could have it their way. Well, we found a way around it. The US has bought them off. This isn't Israel giving them anything. The US says to Morocco, taxpayer. You can have it. Here's the weapons. That's the US doing it. So Israel basically, the US paid these countries off. So it has nothing to do with that. A lot of these countries obviously had a relationship privately anyway, kind of like the UAE. But I'd recommend people watch. It's just 13 minutes. The first 13 minutes is focused on that. Really recommend that. Just before I carry on, how long have you got? Because we've hit. It's 8 o'clock here. We start at 7. We've been on 15 minutes. How much longer you got? Just so I know.
Oh, let's. I can go for another 15 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. For now, I'll leave kind of the settler bit because maybe we can discuss that later. Because I do think it's an interesting topic with Ben Gurvey and Smotrich, and there is just a clear level of racism from them towards Palestine. They just do not see them as people. They came from settlements themselves, obviously, but we're part of that. For now, just to, I guess, keep in with the line of the topic of Israel propping up Hamas, an interesting point that's been brought up by Dave Smith in debates, which I mentioned, which never gets answered by the other side. They always deflect. You can tell in a debate when people are normally on the right side or the facts, because they end up turning to politicians where they go, well, yeah, Hamas, and the Hamas, and it's just like, okay, I get on the other side as well. You normally go, well, Israel, but they always deflect. But Dave Smith brings up, if Israel, which, as we said, is widely and openly admitted, propped up Hamas, for whatever reason, if you want to go nefarious or not, if they propped up Hamas, what does that mean for the justification of this war in response? Because, again, myself, whether you think about Israeli actions and obviously the treatment of the Palestinians, I myself still don't agree with Hamas's strategy of what they did. They're a resistance group, but they do terrorist acts. You can still be a resistance group, borderline maybe terrorist, and obviously they do commit terrorist acts. I don't disagree with that, and I think what they did was brutal, and I don't think it's the right way to go around is slaughtering random people. They could have done it more smartly and targeting, but whether they had their reasons, and they go, no one would have cared anyway. But just park that. But I don't agree with what did, and I understand why Israelis were angry. But if Israel propped up Hamas, that allowed a scenario for this to come about because of their strength and ability, what does it mean for the whole justification of the response from Israel to that attack?
Well, yeah, and there's another interesting, there's an interesting dimension to that as well, because Hamas did largely target military sites during the attack. And I don't doubt that they slaughtered some civilians, and it wasn't all Hamas that made it across the border. There were tons of different armed groups and armed men who went over when the security perimeter was breached. So it's not, we can't pin all those deaths on Hamas necessarily. And also it's becoming more and more, there's just that big piece in Haaretz, and this had been reported on virtually since the attack took place in various places, including especially Israeli media. But now it's come out that there was a mass Hannibal directive ordered, which is basically Israel's policy of if any hostages are ever taken by, say, Palestinian militant group or Hezbollah, you kill the soldiers or in this case civilians, along with the militants themselves, in order to prevent them being used as bargaining chips or any kind of negotiations with Israel. So, and it's unclear exactly with how many people were killed with the tank shelling and the air attacks that the Israeli forces carried out, where they were hitting anything that moves, basically. But That's another reason why Netanyahu has to keep the war going, because this policy of backing Hamas for so many years had backfired, as well as the complete lack of security. If they just had extra forces at the border with Gaza, the border, if you can call it that, they might have been able to prevent the attack. But they were more focused on the West Bank, where of course, Itmar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, and other pro-settler groups were really causing a lot of trouble. So it required more IDF forces in that area. And since then, they've just escalated those same policies. But so Netanyahu has a lot to answer for. I think, to your point again, this idea that we just need to eradicate Hamas, that's becoming a more and more contentious issue all the time, right? Because it's also the excuse for basically thwarting any kind of negotiations for even a ceasefire to end the war. Or to loosen the blockade so that aid can get in. You have more than 500,000 people who are said to be at level 5 catastrophic level of food insecurity from the International Food Security Classification, which is like the top watchdog for famine. But again, those numbers are conservative because they haven't been able to really get accurate data since the war has expanded. As I said, they were bombing the whole strip, but now 86% of the territory is a no-go zone. So they can't get really accurate death tolls or figures on the famine, the state of the famine. But so, the argument is we need to eradicate Hamas. Okay, well, the Israeli military says that that's impossible. Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, the spokesman for the IDF, has come out and said we cannot militarily defeat Hamas. Hamas is an idea; it lives in the minds of the people. You cannot stop a political movement like this militarily. And it's throwing sand in the faces of the Israeli public, he says, when Netanyahu says these kinds of things. It's just complete BS, and it's insulting. Now, Charles Q. Brown, the commander of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said much the same thing, that you can't defeat Hamas like this with a bombing campaign like this, and you're constantly adding to its ranks. The highest numbers I've seen as far as estimates for how much of Hamas's military wing has been destroyed, it's something like 35%. But there's also estimates that people say that they've added thousands and thousands of their ranks, which totally makes sense given if you're bombing people's brothers and sisters and mothers and aunts and uncles and cousins all day, that more and more men are going to join the only militarily capable, or any group that's able to resist at all this bombing campaign and this slaughter campaign that's being carried out against them and their families. So they've increased the ranks of Hamas, no doubt, and Israeli intelligence and U.S. intelligence say that they're not going to defeat Hamas. They're going to remain at least a guerrilla force indefinitely for years and years. So the whole premise is not even agreed upon in Israeli society. The military is completely against this. Not that they're, in fact, even when they're also, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, told families of the hostages who came to him saying, why haven't we had a hostage deal, a peace deal and a hostage deal? Now, most of the Israelis are content with wiping the Palestinians off the map, but the families of the hostages are saying we need to have negotiations, and there is a movement for that in Israel. Netanyahu is standing in the way of this, and this is what the family members of the hostages told the House Foreign Relations Committee last week. But Gallant told members of the family members of the hostages shortly before Netanyahu's visit to the States, it's just unanimous among the security sector in Israel, from Shin Bet to the IDF to Mossad, that there's no obstacle standing in the way of us having a deal with Hamas to get the hostages home and to have some kind of temporary ceasefire agreement. The U.S. proposed deal, Israeli officials have told the media that the language is vague enough that they could agree to it without ever having to implement a permanent ceasefire, even though that's what Hamas's goal is, and that should be the goal of anybody. And Netanyahu has said no. In fact, Herzi Halevi, the chief of staff of the IDF, told him, look, just make the deal. Then we can get the hostages home. It'll give the troops a rest. And then you can go back and start the war again. But Netanyahu has put all these poison pills in the indirect negotiations with Hamas, including permanent control of the Philadelphia corridor, security screening mechanism to prevent armed men from reaching the northern parts of Gaza to go back to their homes, which just means they're probably going to be killing and kidnapping thousands more of Palestinian men and young boys. At a minimum. And also they've refused to agree to any deal that would have a permanent ceasefire. He says that he's able to use this thing about we must eradicate Hamas. We must, eliminate their ability to rule as any kind of a government under the occupation anyway. And they should not have all their military capabilities should be smashed and destroyed. So this has created a situation where Netanyahu can basically use this as the raison d'etre for maintaining the war in perpetuity. And the supporters of Israel in the U.S. are happy to rely on this same kind of rhetoric to justify a U.S. support for the mass slaughter of all these Palestinian men, women, and children in the tens of thousands. And so, yeah, I mean, of course, the to your point, I mean, this is. Of course, the support for Hamas, again, was bad enough in the first place because it was meant to just steal the land ultimately from the Palestinians, or at least maintain them under this blockade in this open air prison, and keep them living under Israeli bombing, U.S. supplied American bombardment, and also living in this rubble forever. And it was supposed to allow the settlement enterprise in the West Bank to continue apace. And so there's no real moral justification whatsoever. And the idea that they especially when you know that Netanyahu and Likud's fingerprints are all over this policy of bolstering Hamas in the first place, which even if you don't care about the Palestinians, has certainly led to the deaths of hundreds of Israeli civilians on October 7th. So I totally understand from a propaganda point of view why they're pushing that narrative. But as you said, in the U.S. media and in the Israeli media and increasingly in the international media, this story about backing Hamas is just completely out in the open. What ultimate effect? I think it's very important for the anti-war movement to know about this stuff, and I hope more of the general public understands this. But I don't think it makes a bit of difference to American officials or again, this was part of the Trump administration's policy. They're the ones that told Qatar, as I said earlier, the Treasury Department said, keep sending the money to Hamas. This is what we want you to do. So it's shameful, but of course it's a good argument for keeping the war going.
Yeah, it's funny when I think it was, I can't remember if it was Douglas Murray or someone wrote an article basically calling out Qatar, going, for years, Qatar has sent all this money to Hamas, and why do they get away with it? They backed the Taliban, they backed this group, and then every time you look at it, like the Taliban, they're like, why are you hosting the Taliban? They're like, oh, the US asked us if we could, be a mediator. And then the same thing is always, the US hosts their CENTCOM there, in the Middle East, in Qatar. It's not, the UK have their only joint squadron of fighter jets with Qatar. It's not just, if they were really up to something we didn't want, we wouldn't be so in bed with them, maybe specifically, because there's other countries to go to. So it's like, if the Gulf nations are doing all this, and not all of it is with the backing of us, where they are sending money to Hamas or other groups, certain members of the royal family or whoever it may be, it's not all with the blessing from us. But when they was asked about specific things, it's normally, the US asked us if they could play this kind of mediator role. So they have someone to, like now do these peace negotiations, like they use Switzerland for speaking to Iran, whatever it may be. So it's quite funny when you look, and people always go as well, like, one of the Gulf nations take in the Palestinians. And it's like, well, first of all, that's exactly what Israel wants. Like they take them in, they win. Like everyone goes, well, the Gulf, what about Egypt? Egypt shares responsibility. Why does everyone blame Israel? And then everyone goes, yeah, no, Egypt too need blame. Like they think that people in the animal community like only blame Israel, not these countries. Like no, they hate Saudi Arabia too. Like we mentioned before when we tried to do this interview about the war in Yemen. Was it more brutal than this one? 377,000 people died, mostly under 5 years old.
Yeah.
You had the cholera outbreaks, the blockade, all these similar things. Again, there was a quote in The Guardian from an ex-MOD official saying, if the UK wasn't there, along obviously the US, there wouldn't be any planes in the sky within 2 weeks. Like there's a good article actually from Channel 4. There's 6,300 BAE Systems employees just in Saudi Arabia to help with the Yemen war, help with refueling, help with fixing it, help with supplies like with it. And they're like, we do everything but press the button for the bombs, because then we'd be like a party to war. And the people were just go, why always Israel? Like, no, those countries as well, the Gulf nations are, just as bad as people's understanding that's never quite there. But I'll let you go, as you've given me plenty of time. I appreciate you coming on. I'd love to have you on again just to discuss. There's the thing with Israel. There's so much to discuss.
Yes,
the
absolutely.
side of things, just general kind of Israeli society, just all the war crimes that go on. Whatever you think about Israel's, right to exist and their right to self-defense against what happened. As I said, I do think it was. And I guess back to your point earlier with the Hannibal Directive and Israel tanks killing people. I mean, I'm not a massive one to move towards that argument, because I think, as in if you're using it to try and someone on the fence, because I think they just go, well, the only reason the tanks shot and killed Israelis was because of Hamas's attack, and they go,
sure,
the reason that they killed Israelis is because Hamas took hostages. And I understand the concept of maybe the Hannibal Directive being quite specific, maybe not normal to what our governments would do. But I guess people on the fence would just go, well, that is actually Hamas's fault. And I wouldn't necessarily maybe disagree with that line of thinking, because it was direct. I know there's the whole, well, Hamas did this because Israel did this, and all of that. But I think that one, I guess if you was on the fence, I think people would just go, yeah, but Hamas took the hostage, wherever it may be. But
right,
yeah, I'd love to have you on again to speak about just other, whether it's Israel or, there's just so much going on in the world. And I guess this would be a good time to plug, obviously, your show. Go over to Conflicts of Interest, go to antiwar.com, Libertarian Institute. If you're bored of just hearing about Israel, they've got South Korea, North Korea, China, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine. Back in the day, you'd get a bit of, obviously, Azerbaijan. He's still, Scott has people on where he talks about lots of different subjects. What's going on in Africa, coups there. They've got everything. Is there anything else you want to say just before we finish up? Or actually, I used to try and do it before, I was forgetting now. Do you have any book recommendations on Israel or anything kind of towards that? If not, you can't think of any now, just send it to me. I'll put it in the show notes. It's great, but it's good to get your hands on books. So do you have any kind of recommendations of books you've read on the subject to do with Israel and Palestine?
Well, as a general rule of thumb, Sheldon Richman's Coming to Palestine from Libertarian Institute is fantastic. And basically anything you can get your hands on from Alain Pape, from Max Blumenthal, Chomsky. I mean, a lot of these, there's so many great books on Israel, Palestine. And actually, I would say, like 10 Myths About Israel by Alain Pape would be a great place to start. And I think it's been like a bestseller on Amazon since the war started, which is great to see. But I mean, right now I'd be happy to come back. Thank you very much, Louis. I would really enjoy, what's fun I'm having a little bit of fun watching the breakdown of the whole Abraham Accord strategy and this coalition that was supposed to be built up against Iran, with so many states normalizing with Iran right now, and basically that whole Israeli-U.S. plan falling apart. It's the one silver lining of this war, is that increasingly the states that they wanted to be a part of that coalition increasingly do not want war with Iran and are happy to just have normal relations and an economic relationship. Thanks to, China especially brokering the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran last year. But yeah, I'd absolutely be glad to come back anytime. Our show is Conflicts of Interest that I co-host. It's Kyle's show, Kyle Anslone, the opinion editor at antiwar.com, and Will Porter, who's the assistant news editor at the Institute and writes for antiwar.com as well. All my writings you can find at the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com. And I'm on Twitter at Freeman's Mind 96. But before we go, I want to say we are doing our summer fund drive at the Libertarian Institute right now. We're trying to raise $60,000. It all goes to payroll for people on the team. And the Libertarian Institute is truly in my opinion, the most important project in the libertarian movement in the U.S. Undoubtedly, we've got so many resources for you. Pat McFarland's documentaries on, the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Manhattan Project, as well as his documentary debunking the propaganda claims about the Uyghur genocide in China. Just incredible. We've got the Scott Horton Show, our show, Conflicts of Interest. Keith Knight, our brilliant managing editor, has written 2 books for the Institute. His show, Don't Tread on Anyone, is just an unbelievable treasure trove of education on any topic you could possibly want to delve into, including he's got a great deal of foreign policy episodes and resources for you. And it's all free. We publish articles from our great writers every single day. We've got Ted Carpenter and Ted Snyder, the two of the best anti-war writers and foreign policy analysts working today. They've written the most important stuff this whole time on the Ukraine war, and they're just a pleasure. Ted is so brilliant on every foreign policy issue. Both Teds are. But we've got just, an incredible team with Lori Calhoun and Jim Bovard and Tommy Salmons, his great show Year Zero. So I recommend everybody go to it. Got an incredible news section there for you as well that Kyle and Will and I are constantly writing articles for you, breaking through all the propaganda. And got all kinds of kickbacks for you as well. We've got about 14 or 15 books published right now, and we're offering them as kickbacks for donations and all kinds of other benefits for you too. So we'd really appreciate your support. And thank you so much again, Louis. I had a great time and looking forward to doing it again.
Yeah, perfectly laid out. I actually did have Patrick McFarland I had him on to speak about China and then also his documentary about the Manhattan Project. I have to catch up to see if he's adding more since then. I can't remember how caught up I am, but yeah,
he's working on part 2 as we speak.
Okay. And I know obviously Dave DeCamp, most people know him. He did his first interview the other day on his own show. I still need to check that out. That's a subject I'm actually interested in. I'm not a Christian, but I think it's a good angle because people love to say in Britain about our British values and our Christian values, which I don't really know what people mean when they say that. I mean to actually ask someone when they say that, because I don't know what our Christian values really are. People always just say cheesy stuff like, family and being kind. I'm like, that's not Christian. That's just being a human. Every culture. I don't know. I never get what people mean. But if you go the angle, here's some Christians, not Muslims, Christians there that no one cares about. That's definitely a good angle. And just while I'm on it, just before I finish, sorry, really good documentary. I think it was Al Jazeera and through Lee Fang, and he did one about the Christian evangelicals in America and their support for Israel and why, and they're all kind of wild end time theories of Jesus coming back, the second coming, and literally, the Jews need to be in Israel to get slaughtered so Jesus comes back for Armageddon, like just bizarre stuff. Anyway, I'll leave it there before I come too long. Thanks again for coming on, Connor, and hope to speak soon.
My pleasure. Thank you, Louis. See you soon.